So Mercedes with another 1-2 in qualifying. It looks like it's going to be a long season, or will it? Well, the trend right now is the first two races and the sprint races we've seen as the Mercedes are imperious in qualifying, with Ferrari being very close in the early parts of the races because firstly they have incredible race starts with their small turbo engine architecture, which also in tandem with the extremely good cornering, low speed traction and cornering capability makes the Ferrari very competitive to be able to stay in touch with the Mercedes for at least a certain amount of time. And the best racing we've seen has arguably come from the two Ferrari drivers of Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc in China. However, the Mercedes has shown to be the superior vehicle across a race distance, of course, which is due to a multitude of factors, but most importantly, their superior engine power, potential or power capacity, you could say, at least what they're able to achieve right now. Not just their potential is extremely high, but the potential I'm going to get onto a moment because it has a lot to do with McLaren as well, which is the main Mercedes powertrain customer team. But Mercedes also seem to have a chassis whereby it's able to be very good on the tires, because we saw in Australia a 42 lap hard tire stint from the Mercedes and they were able to keep very consistent and competitive lap times, whereas Ferrari do not seem to have the same acumen, the same strength when it comes to tire management. Lewis Hamilton has seemed to have the edge on Charles Leclerc in this department. However, when it comes to a collective, when we compare the Ferraris to the Mercedes, despite the fact Ferrari seem to have a very strong chassis, and obviously the biggest deficit to Mercedes is in the power unit, Ferrari are still a step behind in tyre wear. So Mercedes pretty much have the advantage in every department. However, I don't think the gap is really as big as some people are saying, and it will certainly get closer. So I'm recording this right after the Japanese Grand Prix qualifying, and Leclerc got a very unfortunate snap of oversteer in that final left-hander of Sector 2, the spoon going into the straight before 130R. And had he not had that snap, Leclerc would have probably been on the front row, possibly ahead of George Russell. It's very unlikely he would have pipped Antonelli to get pole. However, as we know, Ferrari is extremely good at race starts, so Leclerc being in second probably would have been enough to give him first place in the race. And then from there, we don't know what would have happened. Japan is not one of the best races for overtaking. We saw this last year, and even though Mercedes have a massive power advantage that will provide them a massive delta, if they obviously save their energy during the lap, because of how close Ferrari are in qualifying and because they're actually closer in the races than they are in qualifying. That's been a trend so far. I think Leclerc would have been maybe not the favourite, but certainly would have had the highest probability he ever would have thus far this season to win a race. But obviously now Ferrari and to an extent Mercedes is facing the prospect of a very competitive McLaren, especially relative to where they were last weekend, where they didn't even start the races, and in the sprint they took a step above from Australia, but it was nowhere near enough to be fighting for a podium or win. But now McLaren, I wouldn't go so far as saying that the second fastest car, but in terms of understanding that Mercedes power unit, I think they have a better understanding, because this year a lot of it is about software, this whole energy management and then deployment shenanigans. McLaren, if they want to be competitive, obviously through the chassis front, they need to develop a car that is going to fire on all cylinders. Thus far, we've talked about cornering capabilities, traction, and also tyre wear. But I think McLaren certainly have the potential to do that. We've seen them in the past two seasons, 24 and 25. Or I could say the entire regulation cycle. They went from like 2 years of stagnation or at least 2022 was quite disappointing. They were the fourth fastest car, but they were quite stagnant. And in 2023, they took a step back and then suddenly made a massive step forward, around Silverstone, the mid-season, to become, in the end of the season, arguably the second best car. 2024 and 2025, the best car, ended the season having a dominant, end the regulation cycle with a dominant season. And this year, they look like they're nowhere. But I think that, again, the first two races are not representative at all of how the rest of the season is going to go. Obviously, Mercedes have set a benchmark, Ferrari as well, to an extent, showing that they're relatively close to them. They both got very good platform to build on. But McLaren, their development potential is more than both Mercedes and Ferrari, and the reason why is because once McLaren understand that Mercedes power unit to a reasonable level close to Mercedes's, and I'm not saying they're gonna usurp Mercedes in this department. I think it's next to impossible because Mercedes are the ones designing that power unit. It's gonna be configured in a way, packaged, for the chassis, and they have the best understanding of it. They're the ones who developed it. But McLaren, once they do, and I think we're seeing that now, where they've understood it a bit better, and therefore, at least in one lap trim, they're closer to Mercedes, and they're occupying, third and fifth on the grid. But in terms of in the race, obviously, you need that chassis and you need that consistent energy deployment, lap after lap. And I think that, recent interview given by Norris where he thinks that McLaren can be competitive. I think this is certainly the case. McLaren definitely have it in them to be the fastest car this year, like Norris said. Obviously, there's that potential. But it's contingent mostly on understanding the engine. And in terms of the chassis, it's really hard to say because, again, this is a regulation cycle dominated by engine performance. But once McLaren can get almost to a level playing field with Mercedes via the same power unit, once they have a relatively similar understanding of it, like I said before, then we can see really where McLaren's chassis is. And I don't think McLaren's chassis is that bad. I think it's pretty close to the Mercedes. But I think this race will be very telling. We'll have to, see their race pace. And Piastri looked pretty competitive in like every session that he was in, obviously qualifying fourth. For both McLaren drivers, I think, third Piastri qualified, so third and fifth, I think is a very good platform. And I think it could keep getting better for them in terms of the gap to Mercedes. But we have to remember Ferrari is also going to develop. They're bringing big upgrades. They're bringing innovative upgrades. They've got a certainly starkly different engine architecture to Mercedes, which is paying dividends in terms of the race starts. But in terms of if they can understand all of this energy management, energy deployment stuff, we can really get a three-team title fight, which seems crazy to say now, but I think it's certainly possible if Ferrari and McLaren play their cards right. Now, if we look at the drivers themselves, Piastri seems to have the slight edge on Norris this year, even though Piastri didn't even start the first two races. He's obviously got 3 points thus far because of the sprint race in China. But Piastri outqualified Norris in Australia, and had he started that race, he probably would have finished ahead of Norris. And that probably, by proxy, means Verstappen as well, because obviously Max had to come from the back. And obviously here he's outqualified Norris by a few tenths and ahead of the Ferrari of Leclerc, which will be hard to keep behind because of obviously the small turbo and because Ferraris and Leclerc are both competitive. When it comes to the Ferrari lineup, Hamilton and Leclerc are quite equal, and I think still Leclerc has had the slight edge, especially in qualifying. But I think Hamilton's race pace is still extremely good. The tyre wear, the consistency lap after lap to drive close to the limit of what the car requires to be competitive. I think, obviously, if Ferrari can stay will get into touching distance of Mercedes, because thus far we can say they clearly lack inherently a few tenths in terms of raw single lap pace, and across the race they can stay in touching distance, but obviously the Mercedes, once they pull away, there's no looking back. So I think Piastri could be a dark horse in this championship. Obviously Leclerc and Hamilton is contingent on the Ferrari car, but the same thing with Piastri. The reason why I label him a dark horse in the championship is because it is contingent on McLaren living up to the standard that they've set the past few years. It's going to obviously be harder because now they're on the back foot, but obviously they were in the back foot in early 2023, and look at where they got at the end of that season, and in 24 and 25. They just kept building up and up and up and developed faster than everyone else, left everyone behind, like how Red Bull did in 22 and 23. And Red Bull simply had no answer for McLaren in 24 and for most of 25. So I think McLaren, on the chassis front, I think they're in a decent position. Maybe they're slightly or a step behind Ferrari and Mercedes, but it's enough, I think, to be in touching distance, especially when McLaren have a better understanding of that Mercedes engine. I think we're really going to see Piastri and maybe Norris consistently get some podiums. The reason why I say less confidence for Norris is because I don't think he's as comfortable in these regulations as Piastri is. Piastri seems to be a bit more comfortable in them, but I think this has been a recurring theme for Piastri, unfortunately. At least, last year he had an amazing first half of the season, or first 2/3 of a season in the title fight, and became the favourite, obviously after building that 34-point gap to Norris and a 104-point gap to Verstappen. Then it all fell apart. So we can't jump to any conclusions, but this year there's like no pressure. I'm saying he's a dark horse for that reason. There's no pressure. The odds of Piastri fighting for the championship is low, let alone winning it. But obviously after we see this jump from McLaren in this weekend thus far, and if they obviously translate that to an extent in the race, and if it's after this 1 month or 5 week gap, because obviously Jeddah and Bahrain aren't happening, if McLaren can take an even more bigger step up, if they do a lot of sim work, data analysis, understand the Mercedes power unit more, there is a massive scope for McLaren to be even more competitive and to get themselves in the mix. Furthermore, we could have Mercedes getting nerfed during the season with some kind of technical directive that may hamper McLaren if they do make some gains on the engine front, because the engine front is really how Merc are likely to be nerfed. But obviously, they could have some innovative chassis modifications, aerodynamic gains that could be nerfed as well. Like we saw that flexi front wing controversy that happened. Apparently it was accidental, but you never know. They could do something innovative like that and it gets banned, nerfed. So yeah, I think there's still a lot to be excited about. I've not discussed anything to do with Red Bull and Verstappen. Obviously Verstappen got knocked out in Q2 by Arvid Lindblad, and Hajar out-qualified Verstappen. So I think Red Bull are in a pretty bad position. I think I mentioned in my previous video that Red Bull have some serious fundamental problems, like being overweight, so they need to focus on weight reduction and weight redistribution. The car is unstable, unbalanced, not able to be driven in a way that's fast and unpredictable. So not only are they lacking pace, they're lacking stability. It's a recipe for disaster, and couple that with reliability problems they've had from both drivers in the first 2 races, DNFs. It is very, very concerning. But I think this month break again for Red Bull is a big chance for them to make some steps forward to see how they can reduce the weight, redistribute the weight, make gains in terms of actual raw pace and stability as well. But keep an eye out on McLaren. I think especially in the race tomorrow, But once we come back, we could see something big from McLaren. They could shock everyone with their performance. Ferrari as well, possibly, but I think Ferrari, everybody knows they're the team that's been the thorn in Mercedes' side, at least in the early phases of the races. But Mercedes certainly, without a doubt, have the edge, not only in single lap trim, but in race trim as well. But yeah,